Section 5 of A Bunch of Keys, Where They Were Found and What They Might Have Unlocked, a Christmas book, edited by Tom Hood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wayne Cook. The Key of the Piano, Part 1, by T. Archer.
Franz Wilhelm and myself were schoolfellows and fast friends when we were both boys, learning our lessons with old Father Schmidt at Heidelberg. Had we become Bruchen at the university, I should have called him Drutzbuda, for he was dearer to me than were my own kindred, than my elder brother at Frankfurt, who, when my mother died, sent me to be brought up by my father's sister, or than my third half-cousin Anna, whom he married, and who, such is destiny, disliked my remaining in the house lest people should imagine that I was her child, she being of greater age than Karl, and accustomed to the well-ruling of her household. My father's sister, who in much kindness undertook me, was a spinster, and in the uphill street of the town kept a little shop for the sale of spectacles and wood-carvings to the English and other visitors, so that she was of some consideration, and lived so quietly that, but for her intimacy with the wife of Master Schwartz, foreman at the leather factory, musician and mender of organs, I should have known no companions at home. Master Schwartz and his wife were quiet folks, with only one daughter, little Mina, who, when I first saw her, looked so pretty in her red skirt and tiny white cap that I felt at the moment a love-inspiring admiration which, had it not been that I myself was but an infant, would have thrust a fatal barrier between Franz and me. Franz, however, had not then arrived, but came soon afterwards in charge of an old nurse, who, having cared for him from the time of his birth, and being now on her way to end her days with her relatives at Mannheim, was commissioned to leave him thenceforth with Madame Schwartz, who had been own servant companion to his grandmother. For the mother of Franz was daughter of a Herr Sub-Deputy, but who was her husband, or whether she had been married, nobody knew if Madame Schwartz did not, and she certainly never mentioned it to her dying day. The poor mother was now dead, and the wife of the sub-deputy also, and it was at the instance of the sub-deputy himself that the little fellow, who had a small annual sum settled on him, was confided to Master Schwartz, and became foster brother to Mina. The curious thing was that as these two children grew, there was a strong resemblance between them, so that they might have passed for brother and sister by blood, rather than by that affinity of mind growth which, as some have said, will control the features of the face into outward likeness by the force of inward sympathy. However this may be, they were the same in the colour of hair and eye, which in both were dark, and in that long visage and more prominent featuring that belongs scarcely to the German type most common, and of which I myself am an example. It was perhaps the contrast between us which drew Franz and me into close fellowship, for it is by contrasts that we are attracted, and by the hope of finding in the mind and temper of another that which is wanting in our own. Our earliest affections are made lasting. My first child-liking for Mina was transferred thereafter to Franz, and he became my brother as she became his sister. So when he was to study music, I also entreated of my brother Karl through a letter that I might be a musician, and had indeed already learned of one of the band who played in the gardens on the hill to blow the instrument of which I am now a professor. They were quiet, happy days when we used to go up to those gardens after school and sit under the trees looking down upon the broad silver band of the Neckar flowing through the light green fields. Off on the way from the donkey boys and the beggars to the Wurstbrunnen, or the wooded hill where the yoked oxen toiled up the steep, and the great dogs of the farmers followed the team, themselves looking like the wolves which are there no longer. This quiet life of study and friendship was soon to end, or rather to change, as must all the events of this mortal life. For Franz was grown into a youth, and Mina had budded into a grave, sweet, dark-eyed maiden, still with that wonderful resemblance to her foster brother, which, though not always apparent, made itself known by a sudden turn of expression, or a moment's glance of the eye, or a quick movement of the head. Franz was, as I have said, dark and with deep brown clustering hair. In his shape, too, he was small and delicate, unlike me, who then began to grow of the figure that belongs to many of our nation, and with the fair face and yellow hair that might be seen any day amongst the Burschen at the Hirschgasse. In mental as well as physical qualities did Franz differ from many of our countrymen, since he lacked that calm which is sometimes mistaken for stolidity by those who do not understand composure, and a quiet self-sustentation that accepts all things as of course. It is the want of this which renders your English manners restless, uneasy, and affected, for the Englishman is ever haunted by the fear of being ridiculous, and in terror of seeming foolish, is seldom either wise or dignified in outward bearing, while we Germans are either too self-satisfied or too self-oblivious to be conscious of what to others may seem to be absurdity in our common actions, and gravely commit with simplicity little acts of personal folly to be detected in which an Englishman would redden and almost die for shame in consequence of his exaggerated self-importance. Something of this was, I fear, in the nature of Franz, who was ever sensitive to anything affecting his individuality, and united to this was the kind of ability which he exhibited in acquiring any sort of knowledge up to the point of display, and then leaving it for some fresh theme. I have said that he had genius, however, which gift was not to me awarded at my birth, though I succeeded by application in attaining many things, and at length in becoming a professor of the art which I adopted. Genius, however, will go far in music, and especially with the piano, which was the instrument to which my friend devoted himself, first under the instruction of Master Schwartz, and afterwards at the Conservatoire at Ghent, to which he had an introduction. I must say, in the all truthfulness which I desire to preserve, that Franz was not a great musician, no, nor even a great player, but to him belonged a fascination which made what he did original, lifelike, inspired, and to this sole brilliancy he owed his success, and the name which he was acquiring as a master of harmony when the events happened which I am now to relate. As I have said, I applied to my brother Karl for permission to adopt music as a profession, and he consented that I should commence to study at the same time as Franz. But in a year after that he came himself to Heidelberg, and proposed that I should go back with him to Frankfurt, where I might lodge near him and pursue my education under a professor in that town until I was able to undertake engagements for my self-support. This I was willing to accomplish, though not without many tears and embraces could I bring myself to part with my good aunt, and especially with my brother and sister, Franz and Mina, to whom, alas, a great calamity was soon to happen in the death of Master Schwartz, who, falling from a high ladder at the leather factory, was so injured that he survived but 5 months. This compelled Madame and Mina to let their house and betake themselves to Ghent, where a relative of the family, an assistant secretary in the town council house, had a brother, the owner of a large hotel, where Madame and her daughter would be welcomely received as housekeeper manageresses, the owner being widowed of a young wife not 9 months before. At Ghent also went Franz with them, for at Ghent he could pursue his study of music, and with his small annuity, which still continued to be paid, could live at the hotel until such time as he obtained pupils when he should be old enough, or procured an engagement to control the piano at some assembly concert room. Arrived at Frankfurt, I lived in an atmosphere of music for some time. Otherwise my existence would have been sufficiently monotonous, for my brother's wife seldom asked me to her house when she entertained her acquaintances, and though I had made companions of 2 or 3 of my fellow students, I was too poor to invite them often to my room, and they in truth were generally too gay for me to hope to keep up with them in expenses. None of these took the place in my regard which had always been held by Franz. And the holidays of the year to which I looked forward with most heartfeltness were the visits that, every winter, I paid to my dear brother and sister, and that which in the summer Franz managed to pay to me. It was on one of these occasions, when we had both begun to earn our own living by our art, that he proposed to go to London, where he had, he said, some expectation of obtaining a handsome engagement at a series of concerts, the agent for which had visited him in Ghent, and where he also believed that I could obtain better employment. It ended in our making the journey together, and in our being employed in the same orchestra, he as an accompanist with an occasional solo, I as one of the ordinary band. In London so many opportunities open themselves that those who are proficient in their art find the means of ready occupation, and to both of us fresh engagements for performance in public and for teaching were soon presented. Franz, as I have said before, possessed a genius to which I could lay no claim, and quickly he passed beyond me and became famous, not only as a pianist, but also as a teacher whose connection was growing daily more extensive and high-placed. His absence grieved me not, since it caused no diminution of our friendship, but the rather, as I thought, caused my brother to rely on my true feeling and sympathy when he told me of his successes with the simplicity of the old days when we were boys at Heidelberg, sitting in the hill garden. One anxiety was mine, and it arose from my perception of the truth that Franz loved not his art so much for its own sake as for the fame and distinction which it might be made to bring him. He seemed to me unaccountably to look beyond it, to something further, the real nature of which I could not then determine, but which I afterwards learned was the delusion of his life. Those best acquainted with the members of the musical profession, who are much occupied in teaching, will know how often they are received with confidence in well-placed and even distinguished families, and how it becomes almost a matter unavoidable that they are on terms familiar with the daughters of the houses where they teach. It is to me sorrowful to know that there are some who abuse this confidence, and through the opportunity afforded them of unrestricted companionship, under the softening influence of music, use the intimate relation of teacher and pupil to mislead the young girls by false flattery and foolish coquetting into sentiments which sometimes end in dishonorable passion. This is detestable, but it may be remembered too that there are among the young and well-born ladies of this cold and conventional England some who secretly will escape from the restraint demanded by the society, and who, either unconscious of their own power or always vain of the influence wrought by their beauty and familiar disdainful concessions, lure their admirers to the madness of believing themselves favored, and then turn haughtily away with pretended surprise. I would have staked my life upon the honor of Franz Wilhelm, and though we were now much separated and lived in different quarters of the town, he near his fashionable pupils at the West End of London, and I in a more modest lodging in the suburb, we met frequently and with the same simple confidence as ever. Nevertheless, I was struck with an indefinable feeling of dismay when one evening he came into my room flushed and excited, and after we had smoked a cigar together, took from his breast a case containing the portrait of a lady. It was a beautiful face, but with nothing in it of softness. A dark, haughty, aristocratic face, with a smile upon its lips, such as I love not to see, and with a cruel downward look of the eyes shining beneath drooping lids. Despite my forebodings, I affected to banter with him, and said, "Who hast thou here, brother? Is it a prima donna who has taken thee captive with her singing and Semiramis? Or art thou bringing forward a pupil to the profession, who looks thus on the orchestra and keeps her tender glances for thee?" But he stayed me with a gesture almost fierce, so hasty was it, and showed me within the case at the back of the picture a little scented pink three-cornered note, which he opened and placed in my hand. It had evidently accompanied the portrait, and was written in such words as women learn to write too early, words which seemed to mean much, and might mean nothing. To Franz they might bear heaven knows what of feverish hope and ambition's unrest. To me they were an index to the face that I had just looked upon, the heartless amusement of a haughty woman who played with the love she laughed at. For some time I could learn but little, and sat looking painfully at my friend, whose health always had been delicate. To me it seemed affected, either by long professional work or by some deep anxiety. His flushed face grew paler, and as he placed his hand upon my arm I could feel it tremble. I could see how white and thin it had grown. He was being consumed by some restless fever which would soon, if it had not already, become a serious disease. When he at last came to speak of the writer of the note, the original of the portrait, I learned that she was one of his pupils, the daughter of a wealthy English Mr. Sir, whose title had been bestowed upon him in consequence of his great affairs in the city, and who had married the daughter of a lord. Franz swore to me that when he gave the first lesson on the piano to this proud and handsome miss, he felt a sort of terror, a presage of what must come to him in love for her, and that he set his mind to keep himself from trespass in look or word. But she, whose character was that of haughty contempt to her attendants, and of cold indifference to many of the guests who came there to visit, continually regarded him with meaning glances and glad smiles. Often she made the lesson longer and prevailed on him to stay, and by 100 tokens led him on to believe that she held him in her favor. Not in these terms did he to me relate the course she had pursued, for he still cherished deep down in his heart the faith that she loved him too much to regard the cold rules of the world, and lest he should fear to declare himself, had given him hope and courage. Not yet had he spoken to her of love, except by allusion and by all those smallest familiarities which she permitted, and which none but lovers or dear friends exercise. He had kissed her hand, had composed and written love songs for her to play, had played them to her
with her round white arm leaning on his shoulder as he sat at the piano. And now, in answer to a request so full of meaning that he feared it had sealed his fate, I was doubtful of its boldness. She had sent the picture and the letter that I saw. "But you yourself shall see her, Emile," he cried, as I endeavored to reason with him prudently. "That haughty expression is not meant for me." To my appeal it answered with a smile as soft and gracious as that of the angel in the old picture at Ghent, which we have stood so many times to look at together. "'Tis useless to speak to me of prudence now. Prudence is vanquished by love. Let me tell you, dear friend, I am making money. I could afford to marry, even if she were poor. Heaven, how I wish he had not been born rich! And yet no, for then we should never have met." I broke through this rhapsody by inquiring when he intended to go to fulfill his engagements at Ghent, where he had undertaken to direct some concerts. "Ah, that is it," he replied sadly. "I go in 3 days from Tuesday, and it is now Sunday. But before I leave England I know my fate, whether I am to come back to claim her." So far had his infatuation carried him. "But listen, Emile, you shall see her too on that same night, for there is to be an assembly of her father's guests, and I have undertaken to find performers who can play the music of the latest operas during the supper. You, of course, will come, and when it is all over and the guests have gone, I will ask her that which shall make or destroy me." It was useless to reason further, and I could only embrace him and let him depart. The house of the wealthy English Sir was a fine mansion, stately, standing in its own pleasure garden in Brompton, or at least beyond Piccadilly, whither we went, I and others of the band, in a cab, on the night when I was to meet Franz there and to see the lady with whom he had become enslaved to madness. Arrived, we found that the carriage drive was full of vehicles, and we, with our instruments, entered on foot, to see Franz in the hall speaking, as we believed, to the Sir Joseph, who, since the loss of his wife, himself attended to the arrangement of his assemblies in such things as were refused by his daughter. Her I saw presently when we went up to the room above, where she sat queenly on a sofa to receive the guests, with that same high, proud, cruel expression upon her face by which I remembered her in her portrait. Even as I looked at her, however, I saw it change to a smile, half amused, half contemptuous, and she turned and whispered something to her younger sister, a girl of 13 years, to me it seemed, and shrugged her shoulders with a short, mocking laugh. I turned to the direction her eyes had taken, and saw Franz directing our band where to seat themselves, on a little red cloth-covered platform in an alcove. His face beamed, his eyes sparkled. Alas! Then he had seen the smile, but not the contempt that lay hidden therein, or the cruel laugh which followed it. Many guests were there, and soon the rooms, which were large, brilliantly lighted, and handsomely furnished, were thronged. We played the newest music from the last operas, and sometimes a dance, in which the lady, Adeline was the name by which she was called, once or twice joined, having for her partner a tall, broad man, who came in with the swinging step of a dragoon, and who, though he was perhaps not more than 28, had a face in which it was easy to see the marks of free living and the coarse redness of the bon vivant, not too particular in his potations. Very strong and heavy he seemed as he turned round his bulky frame and leaned down to talk to his partner, until his tawny red moustache nearly brushed her cheek.
but he was evidently a privileged person, for though she at first treated him with her natural hauteur, she seemed constrained to laugh at his sallies, whatever they may have been, since he laughed loudly at them himself. Poor dear brother, I thought sadly as I saw him go up to Sir Joseph and smite him upon the shoulder. This is the father suitor, and no doubt a lord. As indeed so it proved in event, for I soon heard him addressed by the name of Lord George. Franz, who conducted our band, had little opportunity of remarking this man, who moved about the rooms with a sort of swaggering ease, and was to me so offensive in look that I could not but follow him with my eyes, especially when he lounged over the sofa where the daughter of the house sat, and again laughed boisterously at some joke which seemed to be directed against us, as I saw her look quickly in the direction of the orchestra. Presently some of the guests asked her to play to them on the piano, and after a moment's refusal she consented, beckoning Franz at the same time to come thither. With his face suffused with that same look of anxious tenderness which I had noticed in the evening when he spoke of her to me, he went. She performed but indifferently. It was evident that she regarded with more particularity the position of her arms and the movement of her plump white hands over the keys than the rendering of the notes. Still there was great applause, and she told Franz to find another piece, and to stay by her chair to turn over the leaves of the music. She played this mechanically, and I could see that as he stooped forward, she was talking to him, and that his face was flushed. He sat down afterwards by her request, and she remained standing by his side. Never had I heard him play so well. I have said that he had genius, and it burst forth as he ran his fingers over the keys in a wild outpour of harmony which hushed the buzz of conversation in the rooms, and soon brought a knot of people round the piano, where he was sitting, I believe, unconscious of the presence of any but the woman on whose face his eyes were fixed. He seemed to be under a spell, and to translate the incantation that had bound him into music. At that moment Lord George strode across the room. "Devilishly good, but rather long," he said, with a coarse laugh. "Can't he change it into a waltz, Adeline?" She echoed his laugh by a titter, which was taken up by 2 or 3 of the company who were of the high breeding and ashamed to have been betrayed into interest. Franz sprang up. The fire had died out of his eyes. He had turned pale. "The gentleman prefers a waltz," he said to us, waving his hand almost contemptuously, and he came and took up his place among us, only one glance of intelligence passing between him and me as he pressed my arm in passing. Supper was served in a large lower room with furniture splendid and costly, and leading by doors of stained glass to a broad stone balcony overlooking the pleasure garden. For the present these rooms were open, and a sort of tent lifted itself over the balcony where we were to perform, and where also a table was laid for our refreshment, with wines and such dishes as we chose to ask should be brought by the servants. Franz came backwards and forwards, for he had been invited to sup at the table with the guests, and yet it liked him not to desert us. I could see that he was restless and excited, and noticed painfully that he twice stole to the back of the chair on which sat the lady daughter next to Lord George, who had taken her down to supper, and after a word or two went back uneasily. He ate scarcely anything either, which to me is an evil sign, since it is ill for a German when he eats not. Only when we were putting up our instruments and about to leave did he come up to me and, taking my hand, whisper,
I remain here, dear Emile, for a time, until I can know what is my fortune. But I will come forth to thee at once, tonight. So secure for me the bedroom which thy landlady has to spare. And after I had left him there, happened this. Most of the guests had gone, only a few being left upstairs taking coffee, amongst whom was Lord George, drinking liqueur and not quite sober. Franz had descended to the supper-room to collect his music, and waited there, believing that presently would come down the high-bred Adeline, and that he would then secure the opportunity for which his heart was bursting to speak to her boldly before he left London. It was in this room that he had been used to giving her those lessons which had, alas, been so fatal to him. And even now her piano stood open between the windows under the great mirror. So as she came not, he sat down to it and began to play one of the love songs which he had written for her, and to sing in a low voice her name, wedded to new words. Looking up presently, on hearing the opening of the door and the rustle of a rich dress, he saw her in the mirror above, coming softly into the room, and in another moment felt her arm upon his shoulder. He seized her hand and kissed it, and it was not withdrawn. As she bent beside him, he saw that a long dark tress had escaped from the diamond comb that confined her hair, and, having grown bolder, begged her to give it him. She asked him why he wanted it, and, trembling with emotions, he said, as a gage d'amour, he had risen from the piano and looked her in the face, fearing that he had said too much. But she only answered with a laugh, in which he could see nothing of the scornful, and said, "Oh, true, you are going away, and I had almost forgotten it. Quick, then, take off this curl with your penknife, and you, too, must give me one of yours until you come back, so that there shall be enough romance." With a trembling hand he severed a thin, shining band from the tress, which she held out to him in her white fingers, then pressed it passionately to his lips, and placed it in the case where her portrait already lay, next his heart. She all the time regarding him with that haughty, cruel smile, having something in it of amusement and contempt. Taking the penknife from him, she then cut away a thick, crisp curl from his temple, and held it twined round her thumb, while she went to a writing-case for an envelope in which to place it. Words which he longed to speak struggled for utterance. It was difficult for him to forget that she was his pupil only, that she was also the high-bred daughter of the Sir Joseph, while he was but a musician, the teacher of an art whose professors are often regarded with contempt. This he had learned as a part of his English experience. "Best beloved and dearest miss," he said presently, taking both her hands, "to say that you know not my adoration would be untrue. To be absent from you has to me become insupportable, since my heart is ever burning with your self-inspired devotion. I leave the place where I have found the happiness of my life." "Oh, you are going abroad," replied she, "and you will leave me all alone, expecting that I shall practice the lessons you have taught me while you are away. But that I will not do, for we too leave town shortly, and I vow I will not play again until you are with me, Herr Tutor, in token of which see here." And she placed inside the piano the envelope containing the curl which he had cut from his temple, then locked it and handed him the key. "You give me then to hope?" he asked passionately, seizing her hand and pressing it upon his heart. "Hope what?" she said quickly, looking him in the face. "Hope whatever you dare hope." They were pacing the room together, and had entered the balcony, as he poured out a confused torrent of words, the confession of a passion so long concealed and downkempt. As they stood by the balustrade, where the edge of the tent had been lifted, they could see the garden all bathed in the pure moonlight. He had sunk upon his knee, and his tears were wet among the diamonds that sparkled on her wrist. Both were absorbed, for perhaps even she had for a moment been carried out of herself by the force of his heartfelt words, when they heard a loud crash as of broken glass, and there stood Lord George, stumbling amongst the empty champagne bottles which we had left behind the door. He swung around with an oath, and before Franz could recover his feet, had seized him by the collar. The high-born Adeline lost but for a moment her composure, and then she said, "You may spare your bad language, George. Let this gentleman go. We were only carrying out a scene of private theatricals, a little too far." But Lord George, who was too tipsy to hear this sort of explanation, struck Franz a blow upon the breast before he could struggle to his feet, and caused him to fall back heavily. Perhaps neither the blow nor the vile epithets which his lordship used would have so affected my poor brother, but for the cruel words spoken by her to whom he had just been pouring out the love-wealth of his soul. But when his foe once more attempted to seize him, swearing that he would kick him out of the house, Franz threw up his hand, and twisting his fingers into my lord's neckcloth, which came away in the struggle, closed with the strong man. Both of them went reeling against the balustrade, and Lord George was using every effort to throw his more active antagonist over into the garden, when part of the stonework gave way, and both together went crashing down with it to the lawn below. Franz was undermost, and lay for a moment stunned and bleeding. But Lord George extricated himself, and as he did so kicked the prostrate man as heavily as his thin patent leather boots would permit. There was a crowd round them by this time, and amongst them the Sir Joseph, several servants, the latter of whom attempted to raise Franz, but he shook them off and staggered to his feet, looking up to the balcony where the high-bred daughter still stood pale and frightened, but cold and cruel still. "Let him go at once," she said to her father, who had asked her what was the matter. "I had been jesting with Herr Wilhelm, and he forgot himself." Late that night, a cab that had furiously driven along the street stopped at the door of the house where I lodged, and Franz, pale, bleeding, and covered with dirt, staggered in without a hat. At first I thought he had been rejected and had sought consolation at a tavern, but this was so contrary to his to me well-known character that I was filled with apprehension as he sank gasping into a chair, and I saw the mingled froth and blood upon his lips. It was not till I had tried to soothe him, and he had gone to bed, that I learned all that had happened. And then he became so exhausted that, late as it was, I sent out the landlady's son for a physician. For 2 days he lay there delirious, and even when the fever had left him, he was still so weak that, though the doctor said there was no vital injury, he looked very gravely at me and advised that as soon as he could bear the journey, he should be sent to his friends at Ghent. Poor dear Franz! What friends had he but Mother Schwartz and the good Mina? But they were better than I, though I did my best to nurse him, and sat with him night and day, weeping as I listened to his rambling, feverish talk, and heard the cough which shook his slender frame. At length he was strong enough to go, and I went with him, to leave him safely in the care of the 2 good women, who had already prepared a pretty cheerful room in the quietest part of the great hotel, and were both full of glowing anticipations that he would soon recover. For myself, I said good-bye, and we embraced with mutual tears, for something told me I might not see him again, and though he might recover, I might be the one to die. For though to him I told it not, I knew the duty which I had taken upon myself to do. He was my Doodsbutter, and I must avenge him on the Lord George whenever I could meet with that bloated coward. End of Section 5. Section 6 of A Bunch of Keys, Where They Were Found and What They Might Have Unlocked. A Christmas Book, edited by Tom Hood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wayne Cook. The Key of the Piano, Part 2, by Thomas Archer. Once again in London, I spent much time in seeking this man. Outside the doors of the fashionable clubs, in the parks, at the gardens of pleasure, in the theatres, and among the audiences of concerts where I myself played, I looked in vain. At last, in 3 months' time, I learned that he had been in a distant part of England, and was shortly expected back. Previous to his wedding in the high life was Adeline, daughter of Sir Joseph. From France I had heard but once, except through Mina, who said that he was still an invalid, looking forward to the coming spring to restore him to strength. His letter to me, enclosed one addressed to her who had so betrayed him, and as it was left open for me to read, and I was requested to deliver it, and to make known the answer to him, I knew its contents, and what it must have cost him to write. It reminded her of all that she had said to inspire with hope his soul, of the night when she had so cruelly wounded him, of what had been said between them, and of the portrait and the lock of hair which he still wore near his heart. One hope he still cherished, that she had spoken those words in fear of the Sir Joseph, and with a shame to reveal the love she bore him. Let her but so explain those words, and he would be happier, even though he died before the spring. This letter I took to the house, demanding to see its well-born mistress, and was presently taken to where she sat writing at a little desk, in the very balcony where they had so parted, and where, during the absence of the family, the stonework had been mended. After reading the letter which I placed in her hand, with a curling lip and something like a frown, she turned upon me and said, "Do you know the writer of this?" "I do," said I, "and he is my dearest friend." "Indeed," she said, looking at me still more steadily. "Is he really likely to die?" "He is," I replied, scarcely trusting myself to speak, so did her calm manner enrage me. "I am very sorry to hear it," she said. Then a little more gently, "He should not have been so foolish, but I pity him greatly." "Is there no answer for me to send him from you?" I asked, still controlling myself. "None whatever." "Neither in word nor writing?" "I have no answer to give, and shall be compelled to bid you good morning." "One word, madam," I cried, "and I will say good morning with pleasure. Can you give me the address of Lord George?" "Lord George who?" "I know him by no other name. You know who it is that I mean." "What do you want with it?" "I desire to wait on him, madam, and I can then inform him of my business." "He will not fight you, if that is what you mean." "I expect not, madam. He would fear to fight any man except in an advantage. But Franz Wilhelm is my brother, and I will avenge him wherever I may meet his murderer. For he will die, and either Lord George or I must die too." "You can easily use such a threat here now. You see, I am only a lady, and therefore I am not expected to fight." "Pardon, madam, I had indeed forgotten. You have to me given no evidence of womanliness, and I therefore felt not bound to regard your sex. One word more.
to you also this cruel deed will come home, whether France be living or dead. For I have vowed that I will seek out Lord George if he is to be found, and I will keep my word. So I left her, and not daring to write Franz any other message than that I had delivered his letter, and that the lady, who spoke of him sorrowfully, had given me no reply. I waited 2 months more to hear that Franz was weak, and, as Mina thought, sinking daily. I had so greatly neglected my friends of the profession that I was much surprised to find, when I got home one night, an old acquaintance staying for me in my room. Still more surprised to hear the errand upon which he came. There was to be a grand assembly at the house of a gentleman just out of London, and of the band which he had been commissioned to secure, there wanted but one instrument, the one which I played. He himself would not be present, but it would be a personal favour notwithstanding. I had given up attending any concerts but those of the public, especially when no friends of mine were members of the band. But I asked him where was the house to which we were invited. Judge me the surprise of hearing that it was the Sir Joseph's. In the moment I accepted the engagement. It was for the next night, since it would perhaps bring me face to face with the man I sought. My friend's card in my pocket was my letter of introduction to the conductor of the band. It was for me to take care that neither the servants nor the daughter of the house recognized me as a brother of Franz. It would have been impossible. I shaved my beard and colored my fair hair and moustache with black dye at the shop of a German barber well known to me. Then, full of determination but anxious, I went to the house, in company with some others who met at the appointed place. There was again a large and brilliant party. Many of them I remembered to have seen there before, and still the daughter stately moved about the room, receiving the guests, as she leaned on the arm of her white-haired father. Her face, badly beautiful ever, still bore the same dark, mocking, cruel look, but with even more of defiance, and it had grown older and sterner, as though a hidden care at her heart gnawed constantly. I could scarcely suppress myself as I saw the Lord George come in, the marks of an evil life still deeper in his eyes and on his wrinkled brow. As she moved about the rooms, he followed her with suspicious eyes, and no longer stooped over her chair to make jokes. He spoke little, and when he addressed her, she seemed to me to sneer. There was no happiness in the prospect of their married life then, and should I kill him, she would little grieve. The evening passed on with music and dancing, and the rooms were crowded with richly dressed ladies, sparkling with jewels, and with a few gentlemen who had yet come in, for they expected fresh arrivals as late as 12 o'clock, and those already there were mostly old city friends of the master of the house. Supper was to be served at 1 o'clock, and I had determined to take the first opportunity after supper, while the gentlemen were finishing their wine, after the ladies had left the table, to insult Lord George before them all. His medium strength I feared not, and if he challenged me, I chose the sabre which I knew. Should he accept my challenge, he could have the pistol, of which I knew but little. I had just concluded with myself this, when there was a lull in the room, one of those quiet moments, something of the mysterious, which fall on all assemblies. Lord George was leaning with his elbow on the mantelpiece, and with his back to the fire. Sir Joseph was talking to a little group of bald-headed gentlemen at a corner. A knot of dames surrounds the daughter, asking her to play to them. She hesitated, and I noticed that for a moment her face was disturbed, but presently Lord George went to the piano and opened it, and then went back to his station by the chimney. She sat down to the instrument, and even as she ran her fingers along the keys, a strange and startling change came over her. Her face became fixed, pale and corpse-like. Her eyes dilated. One stared before her, immovable. Her breath came and went as though some sudden fear had seized her. And then she began to play. I have said that she was a mere drawing-room pianist, and knew that at her best she could not touch the keys for the rapid and brilliant movement which now seemed easy to her. With a few bars of wild prelude, she struck suddenly into that very harmony which poor Franz had played on the night where she stood there beside him, and with even more effect. As the glorious music rolled forth, and the theme burst into brilliant and more varied cadence, the guests held their breath, and their talk died out in a burst of suppressed admiration and wonder. At the very commencement of the piece, a servant going out had left the door partly open, and as she played, we who were nearest the passage strained our ears to listen to a plaintive echo which to us appeared to come from some room below, and sounded a low accompaniment as on a distant piano to the instrument we heard beside us. Soon others in the room heard this and began to murmur approval, but those who caught a glimpse of the pale, lifeless face, whose eyes never glanced right or left, began to move uneasily. At the end of every passage, the wailing but melodious symphony grew louder before it died away, and as the tones sunk lower, we all held our breath to listen. I especially, who felt I knew not what, was trembling violently, though my limbs seemed numb and I was rooted to the place where I stood, with my eyes fixed on the half-open door. Another minute or so, to me it seemed, and the door opened still wider as a sharp sudden blast of chill air blew through the room. I could see some of the ladies shudder, though they knew not why, and for a moment the light seemed to quiver, and a shower of sparks scattered from the grate around the hearth. All these things I saw, and yet seemed to have eyes, ears, heart, only for one thing. For there in the doorway itself stood the figure of my brother Franz. For a moment I thought his eyes rested on me, and I was about to spring forward to greet him, when he passed, rapidly gliding, not walking, across the room. Nobody seemed to see him. The rest of the orchestra were listening to the music and wondering at its strange significance. The guests were once more oppressed with who shall say what sensation, beneath which they cowered into silence. Another moment, and the figure stood beside the chair where it had so often stood before. I knew now that I alone of all that company saw it, and though the skin of my flesh seemed turned to a film of ice, I said to myself, Franz is dead. Lord George had been mending the fire. Now he looked up, and his face worked and changed from purple to white, and back to purple again, as he too saw it, and for a moment gasped in dismay. Still the harmony of the music went on. The wild accompaniment grew louder and louder, till when it seemed to burst into a final chord, the lady, Adeline, her arms relaxed, her eyes wildly gazing, turned as if at a sudden summons, and with a great cry covered her face with her hands. Lord George had taken one irresolute stride forward, with his hand raised as if to strike, but something in the figure before him stayed him halfway. Evidently disbelieving his senses, he clasped his hand to his forehead. Rushing forward, struck out wildly, but as he did so, he fell down, as to all it seemed, insensible. The form of Franz was gone, as a violent crash of broken strings turned to discord the last bar of the music in the room beneath. Full of wonder at the cause of the strange and sudden prostration which had come upon both the Lord George and the high-bred Adeline, the guests ran hither and thither in a sort of bewilderment, with upon them a strange uneasiness, as of those who have been near death unknowingly. Pale and seeming lifeless, Adeline was carried upstairs by the servants, and a doctor was already busy unfastening the collar and bathing the temples of the Lord George. For me, I went down to the supper-room, for the table was laid with rich viands not to be eaten that night, for the guests were already departing hurriedly. I went for a moment to the piano which stood there and tried to open it, but it was still locked, and so I bowed down my face upon it and wept for my dead friend. Presently there came down to me others of the band who, having heard the strange accompaniment, spoke of it as a capital effect, as though of an arrangement novel and ingenious. But presently came a servant with a commission from somebody to open the piano, which having done by means of a piece of wire, I saw that the broken strings lay coiled together in a tangled mass, and that entwined with them lay a long crisp curl of dark brown hair. Soon the last carriage wheels were heard crunching the gravel, and with the last guest I too departed, leaving, as I thought, desolation if not death behind me. Even when I reached my lodging, I found there for me a letter written by Mina, and bidding me come quickly, for that Franz was sinking fast. It bore the date of 2 days before, and I knew in my innermost soul that to him the end had come before I could speak farewell or hold him to my breast. Still I prepared to go next morning, leaving my address at Ghent behind me in case of any inquiry being made. In that little, light, pleasant room at the hotel where Messrs. Schwartz and Mina lived, lay my dead brother upon the low bed all hung with draperies of white. Lay there so pale and thin, but with such a life look still in his face that I almost expected him to breathe again, or to take up the little nosegay which lay upon his heart and offer it me. For a long time I sat there undisturbed in such grief as does the soul of a man good. Better feelings and holier thoughts were stirring me within, and yet as I took up his white transparent hand and held it to my lips, I repeated to myself that Lord George or I must die. He had been sinking rapidly for 2 or 3 days before his death, I heard, had sometimes been heard to talk in his sleep, as if he was speaking to me, and called me dear brother Emile. How my heart broke into tears. Had kissed his foster mother, Mina, as though with the knowledge that the end must soon come, and near the last fell into a trance which seemed so like death that only the motion of his thin fingers on the coverlid, he seemed to fancy he was playing, gave token of life. In 5 days he was to be buried, and as he had few affairs to settle, his effects being left to her mother, the time hung sadly with us all. Mina, too, seemed to have become preoccupied, and every day went out at the same time and stayed for 2 hours, refusing to let me accompany her. But this I wondered not at, for I knew that she had a lover in Max, a Sioux lieutenant, and my most good friend, to whom, however, she would give but little hope of speedy marriage, as he himself had told me months before. Now when I spoke to her of him, she looked scarcely pleased, but gloomy, then, taking my hand, burst into a passion of tears, and said that all depended on one event of which she could not speak to me, whether she married Max or not. Her lover was a fine burly fellow, and the best swordsman in Ghent, for Franz and I had both learned from him the exercise of the sabre. But now, from being a free, laughing companion, he had grown so dull and taciturn that I saw some mystery was there, and asked him its meaning, to which he answered only by pressing my hand and bidding me wait. It wanted yet 2 days to the morning when poor Franz was to be carried to the grave, when late one evening Madame Schwartz came to me as I was sitting brooding over the fire in her little room, and said there was a fresh arrival at the hotel, a lady only and her maidservant. Wondering what with me this could have to do, I still saw that she was under some excitement, and when she asked me to come with her to see if I recognized a visitor, I knew what thought was in her mind. Taking me by the hand, she led me down the long corridor to an anteroom, where she bid me stay by an inner door, while she went into the apartment on which it opened. One glance was enough. Standing before the fire was a mirror reflected her pale, haggard face. Was the high Miss Adeline, so worn and white that she seemed to have been suddenly old-stricken. The morning of the funeral was, in all things, heavy and mournful. The rain fell, plashing with melancholy sound upon the newly turned earth on my brother's grave. The winds sang dirge-like in the trees. Our little band of mourners, standing round that coffin in the quiet burial place, drew closer together, as though to say, "Who knows how soon another may be taken? Let us love each other, for who can tell which may be the next?" Max, who had looked on death in more than one battlefield, wept most of all, though he held Mina on his black craped arm, and I, who felt as if that grave was closing on me also, prayed in silence. But still I thought within myself, Lord George, or I must die. As I was so thinking, I felt her mother press my arm, and looking up followed her glance to a large tomb close by where we were standing. Half concealed by the tree which overshadowed it, stood a woman, dressed all in black clothes, a hood covering her bowed-down head. And as the solemn words reached her, I could see that she shook with the violence of weeping. Till we had taken our last look and gone away, she stood there. Then I turned and saw her give the sexton and diggers money, and they waited at a little distance, as she knelt beside the grave and let fall the wreath of immortelles upon the coffin. In my heart I pitied her for all the ruin she had wrought, and wondering how it came that she was in Ghent alone, we went back to our home, where we learnt that strange guests had come in that day. Madame Schwartz and Mina therefore busy, and for a time Max and I sat alone smoking, but saying little, for a heaviness was in my heart, and upon Max there was a gloom which I had never seen before with him. It had grown nearly dark, and we still sat smoking silently as the shadows deepened, when Mina came in, and telling Max she wanted him, came up to me, and printing a kiss upon my forehead, bade me to go out into the fresher air of the street. They went away together, she and Max, and I, going out, strolled about the town, on the quiet quays beside the canals, and in the quaint old streets which were so familiar to me. But even rapid walking hither and thither would not still the uneasy feelings which had hold upon me, and I turned back again, thinking that I would sit for a time in the large salle of our hotel, and there drink some azimuth, myself to rebalance, and perhaps listen to the conversation of some chance acquaintance. Entering quickly, I took my seat near a place where I saw 2 or 3 men already drinking at one of the tables. I had not looked at them closely when I sat down, but on turning to speak to the waiter, I heard one of them make some remark in English, and, with my heart leaping in my throat, saw the speaker was Lord George. He then, and his 2 companions, were the strangers who had come that day to the hotel. I had conversed with the waiter in German, and as there were no other visitors in the room, this party was speaking loud and freely in English.
"What brought you here, George?" said one of the strangers. "We little expected to have you again, and especially on such an errand. Why didn't the old gentleman come himself first, instead of sending you as an ambassador?"
"I came without his knowledge," replied Lord George, laughing with an effort that seemed a bit painful.
"The fact is, we are to be married in a couple of months, and I'm afraid this mania of hers may put it off, which would be very awkward for me, you understand, unless the old man would pay in advance."
One of his companions laughed, and the other only shrugged his shoulders, and as he rose from the table to light his cigar, I saw his lips curl with an expression of disgust.
"How did it happen?"
said he, when he again sat down.
"You have told us it was believed that he was visited by the apparition of a man who had killed himself for her. But did I understand that you saw it too? It's a private matter, and I shouldn't inquire about it, but you yourself volunteered the information." "I know I did,"
said Lord George.
"If I hadn't told it to somebody, I should have gone mad. The fact is, I don't know what came over us both. If it had been myself only, I should think it might have been Del Trem, though I never suffered that way. Anyhow, she did see it, and of a whole room full of people, we were the only 2. Don't let's talk about it. I've no doubt it can be explained by some of the scientific people. Perhaps it was mutual sympathy, the same thought dwelt on by both of us at the same moment, and strongly affecting the brain to the point of optical delusion. That's my version of it. But the worst of it is, she takes the other view, and a pretty pass her superstition has brought her to. The worst of it is that the man really is dead." "Who was he, did you say?" "Oh, a musician, a fiddler, or something of that sort, but pretty well known here, I fancy. Though why she should steal off without why or wherefore, and take only her maid with her to come to this hole after a dead man, I can't imagine. She's mad, I think. And you know where to find her?" "Devil a bit, I mean deuce a bit. Upon my word, I mean to give up swearing and drink too, if I can only get this affair settled. She's somewhere here, I know, and I want to find her out before the old man comes to take her home, so that we may all go together. I suppose she'll be at some hotel. I begin to look after her tomorrow, and I shall let nobody know who I am. The landlady here knows, of course, but I shan't be likely to find any of the dead man's relations staying at the principal hotel, I fancy." "Suppose you did?" "Well, I'd rather not. There's nobody here of his name at all events. My man's found that out." "What was his name?" "Franz Wilhelm. I expect he belonged to a low lot, as these musician fellows do, and he himself was a snivelling beggar, trying, as I found out afterwards, to get up a regular love story between him and Adeline. Why the devil he wasn't kicked out of the house, I don't know." "You did that, didn't you?" "Well, I did kick him, certainly."
I had risen from my chair, my hands clenched and my eyes on fire. Another moment and I should have dashed my fist in his face, when a figure sprung out from a table which had been hidden by a screen. All the blood rushed back in a cold torrent to my heart, for there, walking swiftly across the room to the table where the Englishman sat, I saw the form of Franz, not weak and emaciated as he had appeared in his life, but better knit, firmer, and with a fire in his eyes that boded mischief. Before I could cry out or move, Lord George had overset the table, and even as he stood there gazing wildly before him, the figure had advanced at a bound and struck him full in the face, a blow which caused the blood to gush from his lip, at the same time crying, "Liar and coward!" This is no apparition, then, and half recovered, he seized a chair and would have swung it upon his assailant, but that his arm was held from behind in a grip of iron by a man in plain clothes, whom I recognized instantly as Max. "Stop!" said Max in German. "This can be settled alone by the sword." "Who the devil are you?" cried Lord George. "Let me go, I say. Who is he, and who is that? Will somebody ask for me, for I don't speak their infernal language." "Franz Wilhelm was my brother, though not by birth and blood, and was as right goodly born as he," said the person who had struck him, in appeal to that companion of his whom he had been listening. "If either of you are of the English gentlemen, you will tell him that for it to me he answers what to-night he has said, and for my brother's death by him caused in manner most foul." I knew now who it was, and though my brain was reeling, saw that there was a difference between this person and my brother. I have already said how great resemblance there was of Mina to Franz, and now when some of the clothes he wore, and with the disguise of a man upon her face, she was a living image of him so lately dead. "Mina, Mina," I whispered as I rushed to her side and caught her arm. "This to me, this to me! I have vowed to avenge our brother, and have waited long. You must be mad to think of it. What can a girl like you do in a combat with a strong man? I will explain to these companions of this, and take the quarrel on myself." "Emile," she said, with quickening breath, "keep me not from this, or I will hate you to my dying day. You shall keep your vow, and avenge him by letting me keep mine. As to my knowledge of what is necessary for such a meeting as I seek, ask Max, who is the best swordsman and pistol shot in Ghent, and who has taught me these many weeks, till he cannot blame my skill." "That is true," said Max gruffly, "but I have torn my heart with entreaties that she should not do this, have offered to fight him myself at any odds. She still knows no relenting, and we are here." We were standing while the two companions of Lord George seemed to reason with him, for he was as a man insane and ungovernable, swearing that he would fight there and then, or that he would not fight at all. "To fight here would be impossible," said Max, "for we should have the guard upon us, which is what the gentleman would most desire." He uttered with a bitter sneer, for he, like me, desired to take the affair upon himself, and yet dared not reveal that it was a woman who had sought it. "I will fight him here," I said with sudden hope, "with the understanding that the combat shall last but 3 minutes, and all of you shall help him to escape if I fall." "Softly, softly," said the gentleman who had spoken before. "I must say that for the follower of a peaceful art, the Herr Wilhelm came from a family of damned deal more ready to fight than is my friend here, but he will meet the gentleman who gave this blow, if with him I have any influence. Who will be your second, sir?" he said, bowing to Mina and speaking in German. "He is here, Herr Maximilian Faber, lieutenant of the Imperial Army, now staying in this hotel." "Egad, if it be the Herr Faber of whom I have heard, and you are his pupil, George, you had better try pistols," he said whimsically, with a grim smile. "May I with you have a word apart?" he said, beckoning Max aside. "George, you will be good enough to leave this affair to me, if I am to act as your second. I will join you presently in your room." Lord George then went out, and I would have gone with Mina, but she said in my ear, "I am now at ease, for I know that Max will have sabres, and I mean not to kill the man, but for life he shall bear the mark and brand of the murder of our brother and the bully who was beaten by a woman." "I should have killed him," said I. "Better have left him to me."
She placed a plump white hand upon my mouth as we reached her chamber door, and on my lips I felt that the skin had been hardened into horn, in the place where she grasped the saber. "Good night," she said, kissing me, "and see only Max before tomorrow." They were to meet at daybreak on one of the quays lying near the outskirts of the city, where the canal formed a sort of little triangular island, reached by a wooden bridge and quiet at all times, but in the early morning quite lonely. "His friend is doubtful of him, I truly believe," said Max, "and may heaven grant that he shall be the coward that he thinks him, for then will Mina be safe, and either of us can deal with him as I would that we could now." "I will be with you in the morning," I said, pressing his hand. "It may not be then too late." I would not go to bed, but sat up in the sally until midnight, when the house was closed. Then I took my cigar case and went out into the great stable yard and sat down on a bench, for any room with a roof seemed too hot and stifling for me, and I had to wait the coming of the morning. The place in which I sat was under the black shadow of a wall, and whether I slept I know not, but I suddenly became aware of two men standing near and talking in a low voice. I could not see the faces of either, but presently one of them went and brought a lantern. Then I saw that he was dressed in an English uniform of servant livery, and that the other was Lord George. "You can't miss it, sir," he said, giving his master a piece of paper. "Keep the main street till you come to the canal, then follow the turnings, as marked here, and you will come to the stable. Well, he will be waiting for you with a fast horse and a chaise. I will bring the luggage on tomorrow. You have your passport." Quietly, and with only his stick and a cloak over his arm, Lord George went out from under the archway of the stables, and directly the servant had disappeared, I followed. That he was about to escape to me was evident, and I would there and then have come upon him, but for the thought of Mina's safety prevented me. He sped onwards, and I, for some time, kept him in view until he entered the lowest quarter of the city. Then, in the tangled streets, I lost him, and stood irresolute whether to pursue or to go back. I decided on the latter, and had already turned, when I heard a great shout, which, repeated, was borne from the farther side of the canal near which I stood, and was followed by a splash. Thinking it could be but some drunken boatman of the neighbourhood, I kept on, and, as the day was breaking, hastened to tell Max of the flight of Lord George. But I knew from the hour that they must have left the hotel before I reached it, and so went forward to the place of meeting. There was Mina, dressed as on the previous evening, but by daylight less like our dead brother. She was pale and firm, and pressed my hand as I went up to speak to her. Only when I had told them of what I had seen did she fall in a fit of weeping, which was interrupted by the chimes and the appearance of some workmen who were out thus early. We turned back again slowly, Max concealing the swords under his cloak, and Mina leaning on my arm, and were full of indignant surprise that the Englishman, who was to have been Lord George's second, had not appeared. Presently we saw a knot of people coming down the street towards the hotel, and bearing something in their midst. At this time the diligence was discharging its passengers at the hotel, and as the crowd came up and turned into the courtyard, there was a confused mingling of workmen, bargemen, market women, and travellers. Another moment, when the people fell back to make way for the officers of police. Then we saw what was the burden they carried. The body of a man found that morning in the canal, with a knife wound in his breast, and his pockets rifled of everything save his passport. "My which," said the officer, "he is an English gentleman as the title of my lord." His servant had recognized the body as that of Lord George, and had caused it to be brought to the hotel. And now amongst the newly arrived was a white-haired old gentleman,
who, when he heard the name of the murdered man, had fainted, while to him presently came down his daughter, a pale, worn lady, with a face full of sorrow, and dressed in deep mourning. These two went away together the next day. In 12 months Max and me never married, and after going to the wedding I came back to England. But I play not now at private assemblies, and once a year I visit the grave where lies my brother Franz, and keep it planted with soft mosses, which shall help to keep his memory green.
End of Section 6.